Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Audio Foundry. I'm Lanson, and today we're looking at a build log series for my own vehicle. This video is going to cover research and initial build. I'm calling this Phase 1. So, my vehicle is a 2013 Lexus GS 350 with all wheel drive. It's equipped with a luxury package, which has a lot of nice features. But speaking to the audio side of things, it has the Mark Levinson package and the rear seat audio package, which is a crucial feature for me. I like sitting in the back seat of the vehicle when I'm waiting for, say, someone shopping, and I'd rather listen to music. Keeping the rear seat audio functional also means that I have to keep the front audio system functional, not bypass it. So I had some requirements, or what I call rules of engagement. Stealth is crucial. If it can't be hidden, make it look like a Lexus option, except the trunk. Keep all factory connectors and other expensive and hard to replace components undamaged. No cutting of factory metal. Retain the spare and all tire changing equipment. Use as little trunk space as possible. This is a road trip machine. And there's some system goals. Embrace surround sound and multi seat performance for this one. And keep the factory head unit and rear seat fully functional for the reasons I mentioned before. Step 1, tear down measurements and planning. We'll start with the A pillars and the front speakers. As I was measuring for these, I realized there's just not enough room. So this system is going to have its tweeters in the dash, with the left, the center, and the right all identical. The OEM uses coaxial speakers here. Size is about 3.5 inch, but curiously, it's got a little bit of a ring around the outside in plastic. But it's a polycone and it has a 3.5 inch diameter, with a shallow mounting depth of about 1.5 inches and a half-inch tweeter. In my research, I found that a lot of the grills for these cars are plastic, but this particular model is metal. Maybe that's a Mark Levinson trait. So we're on to the front doors. As you can see, the woofers here are 6 by 9 inch, so there's a pretty decent size to work with. This is the front door connector in that boot between the door and the frame. It's known as a door molex usually. This part, sometimes you've got to actually drill through and insert larger wire, but in this situation, it would be a nightmare. So this parts stay in stock. So now we come to the rear doors, which are pretty standard. There's a 6.5 inch woofer at the bottom and a tweeter at the top. The only thing interesting I found is that there's an integrated crossover inside the mount to the tweeter. So next up, the trunk. In my first rounds of research with the car, I tried to figure out what I could do about this ski pass opening since the rest of the trunk is walled off pretty well. The factory subwoofer is in the rear deck and it's pretty tiny, and I added deadening mat and foam to stop the rattles that were inherent in the factory subwoofer. So here you can see the factory amp, and it's in a high moisture place because of this little vent right here. And this is the most 50 connector that goes from the OEM head unit to the Mark Levinson amp. Step 2, amass equipment. Here's an equipment list so far. And let's not forget the supplies and the accessories. This isn't the whole list, I just wanted to cover a few major ones. However, this PAC APH TY02 harness, supposedly this harness is designed to connect in place of the factory amplifier and allow me to connect all of my aftermarket equipment to this wiring harness rather than having to cut the factory wires. Some of the first equipment to arrive was the Savard SQ3 coaxial speakers. These speakers are point source, so there's a tweeter inside the cone, and they have a neo magnet and a cast basket with a matching grill. Here's the test fit with the front dash speakers. That's the Savards inside the factory grill opening. I originally planned this system with a simple Eton sub in a ported box. The Goldhorn DSP 816 Pro arrived next. That's a pretty small processor, factoring that it's also an amplifier for 8 channels. Then we have the Eton Mini 300.2 and 150.4, both very small amplifiers. They share the same dimensions. An interesting feature of these Eton amps is how they're mounted. You can probably tell that there's no mounting feet like a regular amplifier has. Then the Russian Trioma Tango 2 arrived from Latvia. There's our most 50 socket on one side, and on the other, Toslink optical. It should be said at this point that without the special box installed in my system, I really can't meet my goals of having my rear audio and a nice clean signal from the factory head unit. So thanks to 12volt-shop.com for selling it to me and shipping it across the world. All right, now on to step 3, the actual build itself. So the factory is a 6 by 9 inch, but it's very shallow. I'm smacking into the glass just test fitting. That's what led me to run these Eton 8-inch woofers that you see here. They're pretty powerful, but they're shallow. If you recall, one of my requirements was not to cut factory connectors, so I used speaker adapters on all of the connections. The factory trunk deadening is pretty gross. It's a little strip of hardened material, but it's aged and it needs to go. It appears this minimal amount of deadening was mostly designed to stop the rear quarter panels from denting in like an oil can. So I scraped all of this junk right off. I used Stinger Deadener and also Noise Kill by Eton on all of the panels on the trunk. It was at this time when I had the trunk torn down that I started thinking maybe it's time to consider a better substage, and I decided to consider an infinite baffle solution. In the meantime, I had more deadening to do, so here's the fuel door. Those that know this GS platform know that the fuel door rattles even with the factory subwoofer. So it got a similar treatment to the rest of the car and it's completely dead now. And we can't forget the trunk lid, which received the same treatment. I continued my deadening efforts with the rear doors, prepping them for installation. And I found these Red Wolf adapters on Amazon, and they're beefy and a perfect fit. And to those adapters, I installed the Eton rear woofers with MVX speaker baffle foam. And here's the rear tweeter opening here on the door panel side. So here's a little tip from me to you. If you ever need it, just take Tessera tape and wrap it around an object. And this is a fabric tape. Then hot glue that rather than the object itself. The Tessera tape makes the hot glue stick like crazy. And extra strips of deadening don't hurt either. Then the passive crossovers were hot glued right to the rear door panel. Then it was just a matter of finishing up the wiring and repeating for the other side. And with that, the rear doors are done. As I continued to work on the rear doors, the infinite baffle subwoofer idea daydream persisted. I knew the factory subwoofer had to go. It's right up there at the top of the shelf, and also had to figure out how to make a baffle to make it an actual infinite baffle. If you're new to the concept of infinite baffle, it basically means that there is no box. The trunk becomes the enclosure itself, and the goal is to try to seal off the trunk side as much as possible, at least. While every type of enclosure or lack of enclosure has advantages and disadvantages, the infinite baffle alignment is one that tends to like cone area, so I needed to order an extra subwoofer and then I needed to power it with an extra amplifier. And while waiting for those parts to arrive, I decided to start working on the front doors, deadening them with Stinger and then the Eton noise kill. So for the front doors, we're converting from the factory 6x9 to an 8-inch mid bass. So I went with these 6x9 Toyota adapters that Audio Pipe makes, and they seem to do the job nicely. I used the same process that you've already seen from the rear doors, just the MVX baffle foam wrapped around the 8-inch woofer. And of course, the right side gets the same treatment as the left side. Just in case you're working on this platform, this is a tight fit here in the doors. So, bit of advice, just watch for clearance, pinching issues, things like that. And if you're not familiar with that, the purpose of that baffle foam that you see me use all the time, that's to help mate the door panel surfaces against the speaker output. So next up, it was time to start this infinite baffle setup. So I unbolted the rear seat, took it out. So here you can see things torn down for the trunk from the cabin side, and there's this massive brace. This brace made things a little bit more tricky, but of course it had to stay because it affects the handling of the car, and probably the safety. Cardboard is cheap, so I used that to make the templates that I would need. And it's just a matter of fit, trim, repeat until the shape starts working out. Then it's just a matter of cutting that shape out of MDF. In this case, I'm using 3/4 inch board. and I used my trusty Jasper circle cutter jig to start making holes. And here I decided to actually bolt the brace up against the baffle to give the baffle something to hold on to. Then I test fit the sub I had to determine a flush fit. And spare window molding makes a good straight edge for trimming when you're working with a router. And in case you're curious on how I make these shapes with the router, I use a Jessam router table and lift with my Bosch router. Anyway, I was initially set on doing a nice little shallow design with this baffle, but the brace in the way meant I need to add extra layers to clear it. So I did that and then test fit my one woofer I had. And once I had my finished shape, I decided to spray the whole thing with multiple layers of Hercules bed liner to seal it up. And I let that stuff cure over the next day. Then my power cable arrived, so I was able to actually start running wire through the car. And here's a shot of the positive OEM battery terminal. It looks like a pretty easy design to modify for aftermarket use. And this spot right here on the left of the battery looks like a possible path right through the firewall. And right above it, this looked like a good spot for the ground since it's where the OEM grounds. So I scuffed the paint off that spot to allow a better ground connection point. I ended up installing a 1/0 gauge ground here in the middle screw thread that wasn't in use. Just a quick tip, ferrules are a great choice when you're dealing with wires like this with this bare copper. They're cheap and plentiful. And be sure to use a good quality crimper on your lugs. What you see here, that was done with one of those hydraulic $50 deals with all the dies at Amazon. And with the battery out of the way and the ground run complete, this grommet here, this looks like the best option for running through the firewall. And so a tiny little incision in the grommet to widen the existing hole gives the access you need. And then it's just a matter of running this wire through the cabin and then down the passenger side. So now it's on to the dashboard speakers, the left, the center, and the right. And so this red wire you see here, that's what I use to fish the much bigger 16 gauge 4-conductor wires through on each of the speaker openings. And so you can see the dash is now wired up and ready for all three. And so these speakers are all wired up using a 4-conductor wire, as I mentioned, and that's because the tweeter and the mid-range are separately powered with this in an active arrangement. And so to mount these speakers, I simply created a template from the OEM dash speakers, and some simple steel adapters were then cut out. And then the adapters themselves were covered in 1/8 inch neoprene foam. And then deadening strips are placed where possible to seal the speaker, but you can't do it entirely because the factory grille gets in the way with its mounts. Then the speaker wires are run down the driver's side, separate from the power, and then MVX baffle foam was added. And then switching to the rear here, I removed the factory sub from the rear shelf. So then more parts arrived, like the really important pack harness that connects in place of the factory amplifier. And then the Goldhorn DSP can actually be tested now. And so, yeah, this build has no factory amplifier installed. It's removed entirely. And that's thanks to that TY02 harness that I've been waiting on. And it clipped right into place. It fits perfectly. And that means not one single factory wire has to be cut here in the back. While I was back here, I noticed there's a bit of rust on the brackets, but of course the amp is coming out, so we won't worry about these. But it is no doubt a weak spot for these Lexus cars because this is actually exposed to the elements thanks to that flapper door that I mentioned earlier. So the amplifier's out, but there's obviously a little bit of rust, teeny bit, just on the car itself, so I dabbed some OSFO on that. Anyway, right around this time, it was getting very late, but I really wanted to hear this DSP before I went to bed, so I built a messy test run, but it was successful. That's the most important thing. And for those curious, there's a ground point I'm using right by the right rear shock mount next to where the factory grounds are. This seemed to be a great connection for my 1/0 gauge ground. Just a heads up, the Tango 2 doesn't come with a mounting hardware solution, so I just used Tessera tape wrapped around the factory loom to connect it tight. So moving on to the next day with the cured baffle, we put it in place here with clamps and bolts from that brace. If it wasn't clear what kind of method I was going to use to install the baffle into the car, it probably makes sense now. You use expanding foam, a lot of it, and you can tape off edges so the foam falls off much easier. So I sprayed the first layer with the brace bolted in so it could be well positioned, and then I went with several more layers after the brace was removed so I had full coverage. And then it was just a test fit and a little validation of all the hard work. It was right around this time that my other subwoofer came in, and you can probably see a problem here. It probably wouldn't be a problem if there was an enclosure here, but because the infinite baffle design means you can see both sides of the sub, that meant that this other subwoofer that I bought with the little magnet, it's actually a magnet cover, um, that screwed me up a little bit. So I had to actually order yet another subwoofer. So I had two matching subwoofers. So with the first few layers of foam curing, I decided to make a board that mounts using the factory sub bolts and has 6 additional hurricane nuts, because this is going to turn into my mount for my amplifier rack. That means it becomes a hanging amp rack, but I figured it's a good way to save some space. So with that board in place, I made sure the back deck was also heavily deadened and sealed, and I shaved off all of the extra foam that was seemingly unnecessary. And if you're paying pretty close attention here, you're probably noticing that that right subwoofer and that left subwoofer are not clocked quite the same. One's horizontal and one's got a slight angle. So it means I just need to order yet another matching subwoofer to the one I just ordered. So as I mentioned with infinite baffle systems, it's important to seal off the cabin from the trunk. So here you can see all of the deadening materials used to seal off the holes in between. And rear pillars and parcel shelf reinstalled, and the interior is coming back together. It was at this moment that I ran into a bit of an issue when I was starting to put the rear seat back in. The ski pass portion protrudes enough to contact the subwoofers, so I had to perform a little bit of surgery on this plastic. But a bit of time with the oscillating saw and this problem solved. And there we are, rear seats back in, and the car's pretty much back together, in the cabin at least. You can see the subs peeking through the ski pass opening. So back to my amp rack. Here it is mocked up. Keep in mind it's upside down here. And in this shot, you can kind of see that I had to add extra foam, and that's because there were some leaks discovered during testing. You can see here how the amp rack is designed. It's supposed to be upside down right over the subwoofers. And now the 3 amps and the DSP and the distribution block are all wired up. Plenty of wires to clean up as the process goes on. So that wraps up phase 1 of the build log. There are more phases to come. In phase 2, we'll cover some of the dash speaker changes that were made, all part of the pursuit of getting the best sound possible for this build. And of course, getting a nice finished look in the trunk, that's important too. Feel free to comment on the video if you liked it, or of course, if you have any questions, I'm here to help. And if you liked what you saw, feel free to like and subscribe. There's more to come. And thanks for joining me on the Audio Foundry. Take care.